and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiridulwale. The headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his country's need for more weapons is crucial since Russia plans an escalation of the war. Germany's foreign minister walks through Kharkiv during a surprise visit, gives gifts and promises weapons. And the Pentagon confirms the United States will begin training Ukrainian soldiers on the Patriot missile defense system in Oklahoma. We begin in Kiev, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the need for the West to supply Ukraine with an increased number of modern weapons is critical because Russia is gathering forces for another escalation. Speaking during his usual nightly address, Mr. Zelensky says that the free world has everything necessary to stop Russian aggression and bring about a historic defeat for the, quote, terrorist state.
We can
and must counter this Russian attacks with a new level of modern military technology, which Ukraine can receive from partners. I am grateful to all leaders who support us for their understanding that right now is the time for new and powerful decisions, new powerful support. The free world has everything necessary to stop Russian aggression and to bring about a historic defeat for the terrorist state. And this is important, not only for us. This is important for global democracy, for all those who value freedom. This is important even more, so when Russia is gathering forces for a new escalation.
And in terms of solidarity support, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has visited residential areas and buildings damaged by Russian military strikes in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, becoming the highest level Western official since the conflict to visit the city. Ms. Baerbock was escorted by her Ukrainian counterpart Dmytro Kuleba during her surprise visit to the war-torn city near the Russian border. Earlier in a statement ahead of a meeting with Mr. Kuleba, Ms. Baerbock had expressed Germany's solidarity with Ukrainians living through Russia's invasion and harsh winter conditions. And after Germany last week promised to send murder fighting vehicles to Ukraine as part of stepped-up military support, it's yet more weapons for the country, as Germany's foreign minister has promised more military aid without specifying which ones. She said Germany would provide 20 million euros for demining efforts and another 20 million to boost Ukraine's access to Starlink internet terminals.
Kharkiv, a city besieged, shut up, liberated. It reflects the full horror of this brutal Russian war of aggression, but also the courage, resilience, and thus hope for Ukraine to live in peace. That's why over the last 10 months, over the last 11 months, we have steadily expanded our military support together with our partners regarding Harwitters, regarding air defense, regarding Iris-T, with Gepard, and now, as the latest decision, further deliveries of Marder tanks to enable Ukraine to free people. And we will steadily evaluate and continue this process with our partners. I have also brought another aid package with me on my visit. These are, on the one hand, further support with generators to support the energy infrastructure, 20 million for demining. We will also make 20 million available with a view to financial resources that can then provide internet coverage here on the ground via the Starlink project to 10,000 ground stations.
Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, on the other hand, repeated Ukraine's long-standing call for tanks and said he had, quote, no doubt that Kyiv would eventually receive the coveted Leopard 2 tanks from Berlin. He thought that the German government also understood somewhere deep in its soul that this decision will be approved and that the tanks will be given to Ukraine. Mr. Kuleba added that foot dragging on the issue was costing lives, but also thanked his German counterpart for the aid so far.
I have no doubt that Ukraine will receive German Leopard tanks. Moreover, I think that the German government also understands somewhere deep in its soul that this decision will be approved and the tanks will be given to Ukraine. Overall, I would like to thank the German government for all the decisions approved in the course of the last 11 months of war on supplying necessary weapons to Ukraine. Annalena played a big part in approving those decisions, and I'm grateful to her for this. The last big decision is left, the decision about supplying tanks to Ukraine.
And the Pentagon has announced that Ukrainian troops are set to begin training on the Patriot missile defense system in the United States. Spokesman Brigadier General Pat Ryder says that 90 to 100 Ukrainian soldiers will be arriving in Oklahoma for the Patriot training as soon as next week. The training program will take place at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where the U.S. conducts its own training on operating and maintaining the advanced air defense system. The training process and eventual deployment of the defensive weapon system, which had long been requested by Kiev, will take months and won't impact the course of the war in the short term, though once it's completed, it should provide better protection against Russian missile attacks that have devastated the country's infrastructure. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has told United States President Joe Biden during a meeting in Mexico City that Canada would buy a U.S.-manufactured National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Defense System for Ukraine. Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Biden are being hosted by Mexican leader Andres Manuel López Obrador for a North American Leaders Summit. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani says in the meantime that Italy intends to supply Ukraine with a missile defense system as well to help protect it against Russian attacks, but must deal with technical issues before it can be dispatched. Let's talk now to Professor Dennis Soltis of the Department of Public Administration and International Development at the Kimep University. He joins us virtually from Almaty in Kazakhstan. Good morning to you, Prof. Nice to see you and a Happy New Year. It seems that you're still muted, Prof. I can see you talking, but it seems you're still muted. Perhaps you could just unmute. No, you're still, I cannot hear you, but I can see you talking. My apologies. All right, we'll get back to Prof in just a moment. I've got to sort out one or two issues with his audio. Poland's President Andrzej Duda has met with some of his ministers, including the Prime Minister, to discuss security matters amidst the war in neighboring Ukraine, including Kiev's request for Western-made heavy battle tanks. After the meeting, top national security official Jacek Siwere said decisions were taken as to current and future support for Ukraine, but he did not provide any details. Earlier, a presidential aide had said Kiev's request for German-made tanks, which Poland, among other countries, use, would also have been on the agenda. All right, Prof, can you hear me? And let me find out if I can hear you now. Can you hear me, Prof? Good morning to you, Professor Soltis. All right, we'll get back to Prof in just a little bit. Let's take a break at this point, and after that, Russia has announced a new head for the Chief of General Staff of its country's armed forces. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Welcome back. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu has begun a 5-nation Africa tour with South Africa as his first stop. Developing bilateral relations and cooperation are part of the agenda of the visit, which will also take him to Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Gabon, and Sao Tome and Principe as well. The Turkish foreign minister was received by his South African counterpart, Dr. Naledi Pandor, who passed on her government's well wishes on the 100th anniversary of Turkey this year. Ahead of the proposed meeting of Russian and Ukrainian human rights commissioners meetings in Turkey tomorrow, the visiting minister was asked about the prospects of peace between both countries in conflict at this time. Let's talk to Ini John Mekwa on the program this morning. Morning to you, Ini.
Good morning.
It does seem as if there's quite a lot happening this morning in terms of the business. Just update us.
Yes. One of the things is that Russia, we know they have their friendly countries, their friends, and one of the top on the list now where they're having a lot of attention is Iran. So what they're trying to do now is they are creating corridors, trade corridors, either by sea, shipping, or by rail, where they can cut away Europe, you know, from all of that. And it's a lot of construction going on. For instance, as we speak now, there's a 3,300 kilometers of railway construction going on in Iran, trying to connect some of the cities to Russia and cut out Europe. And that is supposed to be ready, at least half of that is supposed to be ready by March. So you see, it's something they've been working on. I think they've been doing it, you know, quietly, and we've not really been getting a tip of that. But by March, that corridor should be open. They have others by sea that they're trying to connect. So this, of course, is supposed to cut off Europe and create a stronger bond between Russia and Iran, and of course make trade easier. So Russia is looking for ways to survive, and they have a lot of help coming from countries like Iran. You know, we talked about Afghanistan, then India and China are still making the, I don't know if to call it cheap oil anyway.
Yeah, it's looking like there's quite a bit about this. And this is all, one, to avoid sanctions.
Yes.
Two, to, as you said, find new friends. And then three, thumb your nose up at the Western economies. Perhaps they're succeeding somewhat in that, because you find that more and more sanctions are having to be imposed.
Yes, more and more sanctions. So now the EU-NATO declaration was yesterday, and one of the things they have discussed is new sanctions on Belarus and Iran. So Belarus, we know they are, I mean, is an extension of Russia. You know, when it comes to weapons, whatever they want to do with Belarus connected to Russia, they are doing it. And now we have Iran. You know, we've been talking about secondary sanctions for a while, but it doesn't seem like we hear a lot about it, or a lot of things being done about it. So if this goes through, because I mean, I guess it's also getting more and more difficult for the EU or Europe generally to get sanctions, because, you know, out of all of these sanctions, they're still careful not to touch things like food, wheat, you know, and fertilizer.
Which could affect others who are not directly involved.
Exactly, but even with all of that, we still see President Putin putting all the food, the hike in food prices on EU. So EU has to be, or they're being very careful when it comes to bringing up new sanctions. As much as they want to deter other countries from collaborating with Russia, they also have to be very careful about the spillover effect. Because if you touch a country like China, you know, we saw what happened when they had their zero COVID rules.
And how that affected the global economy.
Yeah, exactly. So even though they are thinking of bringing up new sanctions, it might be easier to talk about Iran, maybe, because Iran already has a lot of sanctions going on.
Been under sanctions for almost forever.
Exactly. So, you know, it might be easier to go that route. But when you talk about countries like China and then India with their huge population, and then you look at sanctions along, you know, it's kind of very sensitive. The line is very thin, you know, where they have to draw it to do the sanctions so that it does not spill over to a lot of other countries.
Now, South Africa is taking over the chair of BRICS.
Yes.
This is the first time.
Yeah, they've taken over from China.
Well, I guess they're going through the BRICS. So they started with Brazil, then it was Russia's turn, and then India, China, and now it's South Africa's turn.
So, but the sensitive thing here is how will an African country handle this in the midst of the war? We are just talking about secondary sanctions and Western sentiments to unfriendly countries.
Right.
And unfortunately for Africa, we have more of developing economies. We have World Bank warning us of, recession and all of that. Inflation is still surging for most of us. We are very import dependent. Now, if Africa, maybe South Africa at this time,
yes,
but
chairing this, yes,
chairs BRICS, and we know BRICS is against the Western.
Absolutely,
Exactly.
all the countries there, all the countries there,
Yeah.
even South Africa itself.
Even South Africa. So how will President Ramaphosa handle this to keep the continent in between, which I think is what we've been trying to play at.
Well, since over the last 10, 11 months.
Exactly.
Not play to one side or the other.
Exactly. So how will he handle decision-making conversations at BRICS so that it doesn't tilt the continent one way or the other, since unfortunately we are still heavily dependent on the dollar? And
this is tricky stuff.
Yes.
And speaking about that, incidentally, Russia has a budget deficit. Some would say that shouldn't be surprising.
Yeah, it shouldn't be surprising. I think they've even done better. Their deficit about 2.3%, of their GDP. They've done a lot. They have done a lot, because if it was a country that did not have a strong economy, obviously, I mean, Nigeria has less than that.
I understand, and I get that.
I didn't say anything. I did not say.
I get that. I get that. That was actually going to be one of my questions. That when you say 2.3%, I know some other people who
don't have sanctions,
and they are
who are not at war, but
their situation isn't that good.
You know what I'm saying? So I mean, Russia has done good to have just 2.3% deficit, which I'm sure years before now they did not even have anything like that. It does show that they have really developed a lot of their resources. I mean, up till now they're still making billions of dollars from oil, in spite of the sanctions, in spite of the price cap, from gas, from diamond, from gold. They've
managed to re-engineer the economy in such a short time.
Yes.
And to stabilize it.
Yeah, well, so some can even argue that, don't forget that Russia started the war. So they might have had the plan.
They have had the plan and prepared well ahead of this.
Knowing that what countries like Iran face, knowing that they would have such to handle, so...
They were better prepared.
Yes.
Well, if you are going to go into any kind of conflict, you should be prepared.
You should be prepared. They are working on more preparations, talking about like this cutting away Europe.
Yes.
The CBDC we discussed yesterday, ways to strengthen the ruble.
Yes.
Still making countries pay for oil
in rubles.
So
the currency remains quite strong.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Ini. There'll be more of that, of course, on the business news right after this and later on in the day on Business Incorporated. Thanks, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Let's hope that 3 times is a charm, because I understand that we can now talk to Professor Soltis in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Prof, can you hear me now? And Happy New Year.
I hear you. You hear me?
I do. Happy New Year to you too.
Well, it's a happy minus 15 and 20 centimeters of snow today, but no problem. I'm a Canadian, so I'm accustomed to it.
That's lovely to hear. Well, it looks like the change in weather seemed to have been abrupt, and that seems to have affected some of what one would have expected to have been the lull in the conflict, if you like, with everything that we learned about what happened over the Christmas and the New Year holidays, and then the kerfuffle over the truce that Russia offered, but which Ukraine said it wasn't interested in. But let me ask you about some of what's been happening now. There is the issue of the Western countries now doing what they had more or less, been very reluctant to do for most of last year, which is to supply Ukraine with offensive weapons, tanks, defense systems, air defense systems, and the like. Do you think that somehow they are being dragged into this, whether or not they wanted to be dragged, and there is a potential that they will be facing Russia at some point?
Well, I don't think they've been dragged. I mean, they've been coming around to this point of view that Russia needs to be, well, defeated or disciplined somehow. So this is just kind of a part of a continued policy. The strategy from the White House seems to be they don't want to escalate or increase the supply of particularly heavy weapons suddenly. Excuse me. So as not to cause panic in the Kremlin. So they've been raising the temperature kind of gradually. That's Biden's strategy. So here now they sort of crossed sort of a mental barrier by supplying now offensive tanks, but these are light tanks, and it's projected that eventually they will get heavier tanks, Leopard tanks, which would be suitable for a Ukrainian offensive. But at the moment, it seems that the Ukrainians lack sufficient weapons, especially tanks, for an offensive anytime soon. This might come maybe at about end of March, April now seems to be the projection.
But given that scenario, Prof, you and I had talked a bit about this in the course of 2022, that the more and more countries are getting involved in this on either side, frankly, either by way of indirect supply of weapons and training and all of that, which we are now seeing happen. The likelihood is that while all that is going on, something more significant will happen elsewhere, which will catch most of the world powers unprepared. I mean, let's give an example of what happened between the Kosovo and the Serbs towards the end of last year, and the possibility that would have become a conflict, or what's going on between China and Taiwan as we speak. Just to take two examples, or North and South Korea, is that becoming more real even as more and more of these countries get involved in the crisis or the war situation in Ukraine?
Oh, that's a broad question. I don't think so. I think Russia is gradually being isolated diplomatically, and it's losing its men and its weapons. So if Russia wanted to escalate now, to be doing so from a position of increasing weakness, or also maybe at the back of your mind is the nuclear option. But I think these setbacks and sanctions that Russia has been undergoing, probably my guess would be kind of stimulating a feeling of resignation or defeatism in Russia. So among the army, I have in mind, not the Kremlin and Putin leadership. It would be, it would have to be the armed forces that would actually have to initiate a nuclear strike or start the preparations for it. So I'm guessing here, but if I were a Russian general, I would think that, the game is lost already, more or less, or we're losing already. So we shouldn't make the situation worse by rattling the nuclear, the saber. And Russia has been doing this a little bit less. It's been warned by China, by India. So the nuclear option is, seems to be receding a little bit. But what you address, though, is paradoxically what some people call the fear of victory. It's not the Ukrainians who are afraid of being bombed, because they've already been bombed, to the extent of, the equivalent of several nuclear strikes. It's the Western countries that, have a fear of a Ukrainian victory or, excessive Ukrainian successes, as this, sounds paradoxical. So this, this decision following from, Zelensky's speech to the Congress and, related events, that France and Germany and the United States now are starting to supply offensive weapons, and it's foreseen that they will increase the scale of the supply of offensive weapons, eventually providing heavy tanks. So I think the feeling is that the military situation is actually being contained, I would say. If Russia is being defeated or being beaten back on the field of battle, then it means the confrontation, including the global confrontation, is being contained.
Given that scenario, but you're on ground, Prof, in Kazakhstan. That the group of countries that some call the stands, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. They all have, if not for this conflict, but they have had fairly close economic ties. Some of them military ties with Russia. And if we follow the prognosis that you've given, particularly as it relates to Ukraine, does that give the impression, perhaps on the ground in some of those countries, that if the war does not go Russia's way at the end, perhaps quite a number of them, particularly those who had been under the, shall we say, protective military umbrella of the Russians, would probably seek new friends?
Well, I think they are already. Well, first of all, it's only Kazakhstan that has a land border with Russia. The other four are south of Kazakhstan, so they're not so, directed by Russia. And even Kazakhstan has been backing away. I think it's talking about getting out of the Collective Security Organization. France has made some overtures to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's President Tokayev visited France recently. He was well received. So Kazakhstan and the other Central Asian countries are kind of quietly trying to diversify their relations. So that's kind of where it stands now, I think. If Russia is defeated, well, then it's defeated. Then it's, its potential for harm is much less. So again, I don't know why there's this fear of a Ukrainian victory. A victory is a victory.
Prof, the fear is this. The fear is that, all along, there's been some kind of stability, whether imposed or otherwise. There's been some stability in all these countries, including some of the ones that you mentioned, because they'd been under the sphere. If there were internal problems and so on, the Russians stepped in to resolve matters. But if there is a problem with that person who had played that role up until now, then there is going to be a period, and depending on who you talk to, it could be a very sustained period of some level of instability in some of those countries as they seek to rebalance their powers with others in the region, and as you said, seek new friends. Many of them are already being, wooed by some Western countries, others by China, and so on. So during that period, wouldn't there be some instability?
Well, there could be, yes. I can't really speculate on that. Well, China, kind of reliance on China would be one option. Closer relations with France, as we just mentioned, or the Western countries would be another option. I guess it would depend on, first of all, whether this instability actually transpires and from which direction. It would be internal, or would it be from Afghanistan or Taliban or wherever from, and what would be its intensity, whether it could be handled. Kazakhstan, for its part, has gradually been improving its army, its mobility. So if there's not really a sign of any instability here, but even if there was, this logically, Kazakhstan is building up its army, its Ministry of the Interior, its ability to deal with internal or external threats. So there is some movement in that direction, yes. So. Yeah. So even still, so far, even a domestic threshold hasn't been reached yet or exceeded.
Now, Prof, my final question in today's discussion, do you have any fears that if, as you said, most people fear that if Ukraine wins, they have this fear about what then follows. Now, if indeed Ukraine wins, what does that mean in terms of stability or instability on the part of other countries who had in fact supported Ukraine, but themselves had previous difficulties with the balance of power?
Well, if Ukraine wins, it means Russia loses. It means Russia is too weak to make trouble. I don't see a problem with this.
Really?
Anyway, those countries who have helped Ukraine shall have been on the winning side, so it wouldn't be a problem for them either.
You really think so, Prof, that it wouldn't create a problem if Russia loses? Of course, if there's a problem.
Well, okay. The other side, there's one, a view that, a common view that there would be a lot of instability within Russia itself. No, this is very speculative.
We are just speculating.
It would be, completely, unknown territory. How domestic politics in Russia might go. Yes, they have problems. They have, deindustrialization, high unemployment, high poverty. They have now all of these. They'll have all of these discontented war veterans, who know how to use weapons and don't have useful economic skills running around, around the place. In the border areas of Russia, bordering on Ukraine, the crime rate has gone very high because crime is easy. If you have a gun and you're skillful with it, it's easy to, start, leading, becoming, getting into criminal activities. So it's very difficult to know what would happen in Russia. Yeah. That's always
we will, of course, find out.
Some people. Sorry?
I said we will, of course, find out in the coming days, Prof.
It won't be soon anyway, because the signs are that the Russian government, Putin, are digging in for a long war. They're projecting now 500,000 reservists. They won't come all at once. This won't be until the summer at the soonest. They're putting the economy on a war basis. So Russia isn't giving up anytime soon anyway.
It's not. And of course, as you did point out in the course of the interview, that is a country with nuclear weapons. So that is a final option should every other option prove to be unviable. Professor Dennis Soltis, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been a pleasure, as always, to speak to you.
My pleasure, too.
Thank you. The family of a British man missing in Ukraine say they are, quote, very worried about his health and whereabouts. 28-year-old Chris Parry was last seen on Friday with 48-year-old Andrew Bagshaw heading to the town of Solidar, which has seen intense fighting in recent days. The two men had been working as volunteers helping people evacuate from the front line of the war. Mr. Parry's family and partners say he's an extraordinary person who is compassionate and caring, adding that he would not be dissuaded from his work in Ukraine, liberating elderly and disabled people, which are very proud of, and that they all love him very much. Mr. Parry, originally from Truro in Cornwall, but living in Cheltenham, had traveled to Ukraine last year to do humanitarian work after the Russian invasion. And Russian Colonel General Alexander Lapin, who previously was head of the Central Military District, has been appointed Chief of the General Staff of the Ground Forces of the Russian Army. That's according to the Russian state news agency TASS, referring to unnamed sources close to the military department. Mr. Lapin's appointment took place at the end of 2022, another source had told TASS. There were no official state announcements about the appointment, and Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov also declined to confirm. Military analysts in Matvev characterized Mr. Lapin's promotion as more of a bureaucratic position and not a military one. General Lapin, despite having received the Hero of Russia medal, was heavily criticized by the head of the Chechen Republic and Mr. Putin's trusted ally, Ramzan Kadyrov, and Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose Wagner group of private military contractors are involved in fighting in the east of Ukraine. China's ambassador to Australia, Zhou Jiang, says Canberra should be wary of its relationship with Japan reminding them that Japanese troops attacked Australia during World War II and could do the same again. Mr. Chen says, quote, "If we forget history, history might repeat itself." During the Second World War, Japan invaded Australia, bombed Darwin, killed Australians, and treated Australian prisoners of war in a way that was humanely unacceptable. The Chinese ambassador also incorrectly claimed that Japan had not apologized for its World War II actions concerning Australia and could therefore repeat them. Mr. Zhao made the comments after a journalist had asked about remarks made by the Japanese ambassador to Australia, Shingo Yamagami, who said Australia and Japan should remain vigilant in relations with China. In Iran, the daughter of its former president Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani has been sentenced to 5 years in prison. The verdict against Faiza Hashemi, who is a known Iranian activist, is not final, according to lawyer Nida Shams, who was speaking in a tweet. The client is still in prison and there are other cases against her. State-aligned news agency ISNA had said Hashemi was indicted last year by Tehran's public prosecutor on charges of propaganda against the system. She was arrested and transferred to Irvin prison in September. Iran has detained a number of high-profile activists in recent months, including writer and poet Mona Bouzy, singer Shervin Hajipour, and Iranian football player Hossein Mahini, as anti-government protests had rocked the country. Over the past decade, Mr. Hashemi had been jailed several times for making anti-government statements and participating in protests. Let's take a second break, and when we return, we'll be taking a look at some of the sports out of the conflict, plus aid to Bakhmut. Stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Let's talk now to Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, public policy analyst, joins us via Zoom from the nation's commercial capital. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time, and a Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Laddie, and it's good to be on the program again.
Indeed. So many things are happening. As some people would say, this conflict has assumed, many moving parts. What do you make of the Western decision now to supply Ukraine with offensive weapons?
I've been listening to your program since it started, and it's very, very interesting, the different angles that have come on stage. My simple contribution is, look, whether we like it or not, everyone is trying to protect their own space. So the Europeans are saying, what kind of deal are we getting from the expanse? I mean, the truth of the matter is we're not getting that. We're not getting the kind of support, and we also need to look like the good monitor in the house. We must be seen as doing the right thing to ensure that this kind of thing is not repeated elsewhere. So yes, they traded with caution at the beginning. They didn't want to come all the way, but gradually things, and I'm sure you know, we're almost a year into this. We started in February last year. So obviously over time they would start to increase, as it were, their contribution and sort of offensive contribution, if I want to clearly define it, into this war. So basically, that's what it is right now. The truth is, one will have thought that by now we'll be over with this, but unfortunately, it has continued to go, in different angles. Like you said, it's been moving, and it's an unfortunate development. But yes, the situation is the Europeans have to do more than they have been doing before.
More and more people are being willy-nilly dragged into this, whether they want to or not. Some want to, some have been actively trying to get in, and then others by default are being pulled in the sense that as more and more people get involved, then it becomes more and more complicated. And because it gets more complicated, it becomes more difficult to resolve whenever it is time to resolve it. Is that a situation that we find ourselves now? And how do we walk back if we're going to walk back?
Truth is, if anybody would say to you, this is the way we're going to walk back now, I guess that person will not be completely saying the truth. Like you said, all sorts of things are coming on board, but some of us are very careful, and I'm sure that party will not come for anything, but we're saying, look, we have to find a way out of this because it's not logically making any sense. It's very historical. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia is historical. I mean, this has happened before the Soviet Union, when they had the Russian Empire and all of that. And there's a lot to chew on this. I mean, there's very, very rich mineral resources. There's power. You talk about the fact that there's so much nuclear power in all of this. So it's a very difficult and complex situation. And so to clearly say that this is the way we're going to walk out of this would be a very difficult, road to toe. I would just say that we're hopeful that as these many people come on board, the reasons will be seen that we cannot continue to condone this. We cannot continue to fund this. It might be small, but I'm happy to some extent that Russia kind of suffered some small level of inflation last year, and I'm hoping. And of course, like I said, it's not something that one should rejoice about. The fact that they're also suffering, more casualty. Maybe that might inform everything. That might sort of whip up some sentiment even back up and say, guys, are we sure we should be pursuing this? Is this a profitable venture? I mean, if we want to get this and we're losing this much, is it something we should continue? So those are some of the things I hope will happen, because truth is, at this junction, it is difficult to emphatically say that this is the way to work out of it.
Indeed, we shall have to wait and see how these things unfold. Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, as always, much gratitude for your time on the program this morning. We will get back to you probably sooner than you think for us to update this discussion, because there's so much more to talk about, but our time is up. But thank you, and do have yourself a pleasant day ahead.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Let's take a quick look at the sport here. Ukraine's men's ice hockey team played at a packed Canada Life Center in downtown Winnipeg before the start of the International University Sports Federation Winter World University Games. The University of Manitoba Bison's men's hockey team welcomed the Ukrainian side for a warm-up game before they headed to Lake Placid in uptown New York. The match was a part of the Hockey Can't Stop Tour, an initiative that aims to raise money for the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, which supports humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. An ice rink in the Ukrainian town of Drushkivka in the Donetsk region was destroyed last week as Ukraine remains under attack by Russian forces. And finally on the program, a group of volunteers have brought humanitarian aid to Bakhmut residents hiding in their basements. The intermittent sound of explosions could be heard as volunteers went from one basement to the next. Under constant shelling, Bakhmut residents have been living for months without gas and electricity. A 70-year-old local resident, Lydia says, quote, "I sleep in the same clothes I walk around in. We haven't had our baths for 4 months. Soon everything will freeze, both kitchen and toilet. The good will prevail over the evil," says another local volunteer. McCallers boxes with humanitarian aid are brought to one of the basements. Despite the dreadful conditions, people say they are trying to help each other. Hileb, a 14-year-old local resident, brings aid to people who are unable to get out of their flats. Ukraine says it was strengthening its forces around Bakhmut in the eastern Donbas region and repelling constant attacks there by Russian mercenary group Wagner. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akiri Dulwale. Do have a pleasant day ahead. Good morning.